Are you wondering what I'm cooking? Yup, it's something delicious today. Well, howdy do. That's the diet most cowboys in the Wild West loved during their travels. And by loved, I mean they basically had no choice. But you know what else they had no choice in? Hygiene, or lack thereof. It ain't called the Wild West for nothing. From poor bathroom conditions, dental care practices that seemed like they were taken out of a horror movie, to the wild and bizarre act of spitting everywhere and anywhere, the Wild West wasn't called wild for nothing. Today on Saucy History, I'm taking you to the horrible hygienic conditions of the Wild West. Well, folks, while we're simmering our beans here, let's talk about something that's definitely not appetizing: the bathroom situation in the Wild West. Now, imagine this. You're out there in the great open, living the cowboy dream. But when nature calls, your options are, well, pretty limited. Cowboys use an outhouse, a splintery wooden box with a hole. It wasn't fancy, and splinters were a real concern. Folks, if you think toilet paper is a given, think again. Back then, it was corn cobs, newspapers, and if you were lucky, early versions of toilet paper that still might give you splinters. Now, these outhouses weren't just fragrant bouquet of pine. They were battleground against flies, heat, and dare I say, the occasional curious spider. And if you think that's bad, winters certainly weren't any easier. The thunder mug, or chamber pot, was your best friend. You wouldn't want to try and find an outhouse in the middle of the freezing winter, right? But come morning, you had the lovely task of disposing of its contents. Charming, isn't it? And baths? Oh, those were a luxury. Most settlers made do with streams or horse troughs. If you were lucky enough to have a tub, the whole family shared the same bathwater. Imagine being the last one in that lineup. And for high rollers traveling by train? Well, let's just say the bathroom situation was as basic as it gets. A wooden box positioned over the train tracks for men. Human waste would simply drop directly onto the tracks through this drop-chute system. Women had similar but slightly nicer facilities. And by nice, I mean if you put a flower on an ogre's ear. Immigrants? Now they had it even tougher. They didn't even have the same amenities as other passengers. Instead of a wooden box, immigrants had to make do with a wooden flap in the door that opened directly to the tracks below, which is even less private. Makes you appreciate our modern conveniences, doesn't it? Next time you grumble about a slow-draining shower, remember the Wild West. It gives roughing it a whole new meaning. Alright folks, while our beans are bubbling away, let's chew over something else. The toothy troubles of the Wild West. Now, if you think a visit to the dentist is daunting today, let me tell you, back then, it was the stuff of nightmares. In the dusty streets of Tombstone or Dodge, dental care was as rough and rugged as the landscape. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, and floss? Not in this picture, my friends. When a tooth acted up, the solution was simple yet brutal. Yank it the crud out. And who do you think did these extractions? Wild West dentists, you may think. But what do you think this is, the modern era? Those people didn't exist back then. Barbers and blacksmiths equipped with nothing fancier than pliers and a strong grip. And aesthetics? Ha! A swig of whiskey was about as good as it got. But it gets better or worse. Do you know what this is? This is called a toothbrush. Yes, they had toothbrushes back then. Only they weren't personal. They were for everyone. In some places, people shared a community toothbrush that hung by stagecoach stations. They're free to use for anyone who wanted to clean their pearly, gingivitis. Imagine that after a hearty meal at the saloon. But we gotta remember, people back then didn't exactly know that germs could spread around. To put it into perspective, the discovery of hygienic practices was as revolutionary as the discovery that we could blow each other up into smithereens with giant bombs. Speaking of saloons, they weren't just about whiskey and card games. They were hubs of, let's call it, creative hygiene. Imagine stepping into a bustling saloon, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and whiskey. You'd likely find spittoons lined up brimming with, well, let's just say they weren't filled with soup. In those days, spitting tobacco was as common as dust in the desert, and those brass spittoons were a key part of this scenery. Now, spitting wasn't just for the saloons though. It was a widespread habit, seen as normal as shaking hands. Thankfully, by the 20th century, folks started realizing that spitting could spread illnesses like tuberculosis. Can you imagine the horror of realizing that your everyday habit was, well, getting rid of generations of people? Well, the Wild West wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Life back then was a real doozy. First off, cholera was the real villain, not the quick-draw duels you see in the movies. This nasty bug, lurking in water sources, hit folks with severe diarrhea and vomiting. No fancy filters back then, so drinking water was like playing Russian roulette. And if you think modern whiskey is rough, Old West whiskey was a concoction of anything from axle grease to cider vinegar. They called it coffin varnish for a reason. Violence? Oh, now that was real. In Dodge City, for instance, you had a 1 in 61 chance of biting the dust violently between 1876 and 1885. The homicide rate was sky high compared to today. And getting to the Wild West in the first place? Now that was a gamble in itself. On the Oregon Trail, 1 in 10 never made it to their dreamland. Accidents, diseases, harsh weather, you name it. Then there's the tragedy of the Native Americans. From millions down to only 238,000 by the end of the 19th century. Diseases like smallpox, wars, massacres, the Trail of Tears. Heartbreaking, really. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. The next time you romanticize the Wild West, remember, it was tough as nails. Sure makes our modern problems seem a little less daunting, doesn't it?